My name is Warda Abdullahi, and I was born in Saudi Arabia.
Warda Abdullahi was born a refugee in the late 90s.
I have lived in many different places throughout Africa where I faced many obstacles, such as loss of education, living through a drought, losing my mother. But after everything, I still succeeded.
Warda's parents are Somali, but their ancestral land is in Ethiopia, where they lived until war forced them to flee. They ended up in Saudi Arabia, undocumented, constantly at risk of deportation. That is where they got married and had Warda.
My father got deported multiple times, and the fourth time, it was right after I was born. He came back, and then he tells my mom, this cannot continue. It's not safe for all of us. How about I send you and Warda to Ethiopia?
The plan was for him to join them once he saved enough money. But Warda's mother did not want to leave without him and resisted right up until the last minute. When the departure finally came, it was all such a rush. She forgot to bring Warda's birth certificate and ID, a mistake that still haunts the family.
Once we got to Ethiopia, I got very sick, and the hospitals in Ethiopia would not accept me. They said my mother has to bring some sort of papers. If you have no papers, we cannot do anything for you. My mom, she couldn't bear and just watch me getting worse each day.
Warda's mother knew the hospitals in Saudi Arabia would treat her sick baby. So she made the desperate decision to sneak back into the country she had just left. That meant taking a smuggler's boat across the Red Sea. Warda was 8 months old. An uncle agreed to go with them.
The boat was, overcrowded. It was so many people. And it sank in the middle of the sea. Most of the people died right there because they didn't know how to swim, including my mother.
Luckily, Warda's uncle could dog paddle a little, and he managed to find her miraculously, just bobbing in the water.
I don't know how it happened, but, my mother wrapped me on a little blanket while we were boarding. So the blanket she wrapped me around was just floating on top of the water. Not even water got into my face or anything. I was just floating on top of the sea. And my uncle got hold of me. By the time he got to my mom, it was too late. She was already dead. The blanket that my mother wrapped around me is what saved me. It was, a miracle. It was, meant for me to be talking to you today. I live in Minnesota now. I graduated from St. Catherine University with a bachelor's degree in public health, while I also wrote my book called Warda.
I didn't realize
That's an interesting question.
I've never heard of it from that
So let's talk about that.
I think you need to come over, stand in my shoes.
Agree to disagree.
This is Top of Mind. I'm Julie Rose. Today on the show, stories of becoming a refugee, resettling in the United States, and building a new life. The UN Refugee Agency says 1 out of every 95 people on Earth has fled their home because of conflict or persecution. Half of the world's refugees are children. A tiny fraction will come to America. Most will be assigned to resettle in a city where they know not a single soul. How well and how quickly they manage to thrive depends on how we welcome them into our communities. We can do more. Two themes stand out in Warda Abdullahi's story: miracles and mentors. The blanket that kept her afloat when the boat capsized at sea was the first. But it would take many more of both for her to become the 25-year-old college graduate she is today, with a published memoir and plans for medical school.
I was just, a shepherd girl looking after cows and goats and sheep.
After her mother died at sea, Warda's uncle took her to her grandparents' farm in Ethiopia. Warda's father came from Saudi Arabia to get her. But in the late 90s, Somali men were being targeted in Ethiopia, and it wasn't safe for him to stay. So he left baby Warda with his parents and fled to South Africa, on the opposite end of the continent. There, he was again undocumented, which meant he couldn't fly back to visit his daughter.
So my grandparents took care of me until I was 10. I called my grandfather my father, and I didn't know my dad actually existed. The only father I knew was my grandfather.
Meanwhile, Warda's father was building a new life in South Africa. He had a successful business. He remarried and had more kids. And around the time Warda turned 10, he started having nightmares.
Every single night. And the nightmares consisted of just me, getting married young and having no education. And that scared him.
Education had meant everything to Warda's father growing up. As a teenager, he'd left the family farm in Ethiopia on his own to attend high school. Then he worked for years to save money for college, but his father took that money and spent it on supplies for the family during a drought. Warda's father vowed it would be different for his children.
So he tells my grandfather that he wants to bring me to South Africa so that I can get education. It was end of 2008.
And it was 4,000 miles from her grandfather's farm in Ethiopia to Port Elizabeth, South Africa, where her father lived. 4,000 miles. Warda, who was 10, was still undocumented, so she couldn't just take a plane. Instead, she traveled the length of Africa with a series of relatives and family friends, on foot, by car, in a bus that crashed when the driver fell asleep.
That was the most terrifying thing throughout my journey.
They'd been on the bus for about 5 hours. Warda had drifted off.
And I wake up, all this loud noises going on and everybody crying. Everybody was looking for their family member. And I see blood everywhere, people laying on the floor in the bus. I honestly believe that God was just looking out for me, as I had no family member or any friends to take the journey with.
When she finally reached South Africa, she had to sneak across the border.
We have to hide in the bushes. It was terrifying for a 10-year-old with no family member with her. I was just walking with random strangers that I never met before. So it was terrifying. But looking back, everything worked out for the best.
In South Africa, her father struggled to find a school that would accept Warda, who had never been to any school, had no transcripts, couldn't read or write, only spoke Somali.
They would say, we are sorry, but we can't accept her. How are we supposed to teach her? She doesn't understand English. At the end, there was this one school that, accepted me. They put me into 6th grade because of my age. And I remember the teacher asking me, "What's your name?" And I had no idea what she was saying.
The next day, they put Warda in a 2nd grade class with much younger kids.
It was the same thing, though. I had no clue what they were saying, but the teachers were very sweet. They, helping me before school starts and even after school. And up till today, I really appreciate the support they gave me. Without them, I wouldn't be here today.
A similar thing would play out 4 years later when anti-immigrant violence forced Warda's family to flee South Africa. This time they were granted asylum in America. With no relatives already in the United States, the State Department sent them to Grand Rapids, Michigan.
We arrived November 6, 2013. And we remember the first time it snowed, we were just testing the snow. And we thought that the snow would taste like sugar. We assumed it would.
Again, Warda found herself enrolled in an unfamiliar school, this time a large public high school. She was a 16-year-old freshman still mastering English.
The schools were big, and I was the only first Muslim student wearing hijab. And everybody was just staring at me weirdly. And it was hard, honestly. I remember just telling my dad, I cannot keep up. It's very hard. And I remember staying up till 1 o'clock trying to do assignments. But he's like, with every darkness, there's lights at the end of it. So just keep trying and ask for help. That's one thing that he always encouraged me to do. If you don't understand something, there's somebody else that understands it and able to help you. So my 2nd semester, I went to join clubs and going to tutoring. I asked my teachers for help whenever they were able to help me. And from there, my grades improved.
Again, Warda's teachers went out of their way to support her. Then she found a mentor.
My name is Mackenzie Wellman, and I'm Warda's mentor from high school. I kind of reached that point in my adulthood where I wanted to give back to the community. And I found this mentor-mentee kind of relationship through the Rotary Club.
When I met her, she started shaking my hand, and her handshake was like very strong. And I was like, wow, amazing. I didn't know how this will turn out, but meeting Mackenzie was one of the best things that happened to me.
I was there to help guide her in her coursework to make sure that she was on schedule to graduate.
Early on, Mackenzie learned that Warda hoped to become a doctor, but she was already so much older than the typical high school student. So together, they made a plan to get Warda to graduation before she turned 21.
There was definitely moments where I'd go home and be like, what is this girl going to do? That's a lot to overcome. The daily grind, I think, was the hardest to watch her because she showed up every day and took on the classes, and she did a lot of the solving in terms of credits for high school and all of that on the front end. And so I would go home and I would fret. And then when I come back a week later, she already had been solving things. We were a pretty good team.
As graduation approached, Mackenzie and Warda started spending Saturdays working on college applications and applying for scholarships. Mackenzie also taught Warda how to drive. That got a little hairy.
And there are so many times I almost, run into her and walls. And she went through a lot with me, but I am so thankful of all the things that she have taught me.
Warda says the biggest lesson she learned from Mackenzie was how to be independent and advocate for herself. Like the time Warda's high school adopted a dress code requiring students wear pants and short sleeves. That was more revealing attire than Warda was comfortable with. So Mackenzie helped her get an exception to keep wearing her traditional clothes and head covering.
That was a big moment for Warda when she realized that if you stand up for yourself with who you are and what culture you came from, what religion you believe in, and you're not hurting anybody, then you can have confidence to move forward in this world with who you are.
Warda says her father was particularly pleased with Mackenzie's influence as a 27-year-old, college-educated woman with a successful business career and an understanding of how to succeed in America.
He always told me, she is the only role model you have right now, and you should always look up to her and ask her for guidance, because I would love to help you through every situation you are in, but I have no experience or the knowledge. So he was really happy and thankful that I have met Mackenzie, and they became very close.
Mm-hmm. I call him Abo.
You call him Abo? What is that, father?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And just shy of her 21st birthday, Warda became the first person in her family to graduate from high school.
That was emotional. Warda had like a tribe that showed up that day to support her from high school. And it was very fulfilling to watch her complete one big step of her journey and move on to the other and have everything sort of organized. And she was going to go live in Minnesota, and she was in love, with her future husband. So it was just like this big, beautiful, ending that was really a beginning.
Warda was headed to a private liberal arts college in Minnesota, where her family had relocated. She'd won enough scholarships to cover the entire expense. In 2020, she graduated with her bachelor's degree in public health and plans to go to medical school. Her new memoir is called Warda: My Journey from the Horn of Africa to a College Education.
I want to share my story because I want people to know that anything is possible. I was once a shepherd girl, just, being in the farm and having no sort of education. And look at me today, not to brag or anything like that, but it's possible for you to achieve your dreams and goals. And be who you want to be and just be amazing.
Warda is amazing, and she's lucky to have found the support she needed to succeed in school. Refugees who arrive in the U.S. as teenagers, like Warda did, can easily slip through the cracks of the school system.
He looked up at me and said, "Coach, I can't read." He was 12 at the time, and he had been in the public school system for 3 years. And I asked myself, if this was my kid, what would I do?
Luma Mufla started her own school for refugee kids. This is Top of Mind. I'm Julie Rose. Luma Mufla's life work on behalf of refugee children began with a wrong turn. She was living on the outskirts of Atlanta at the time and stopped for groceries after work.
And on the way back from that grocery store, I missed my turn. Ended up driving through a neighborhood that was only 5 miles from where I lived, but was so unfamiliar, yet very familiar. There was a mosque, then a Buddhist temple, a lot of women wearing hijab. There was a group of kids outside playing soccer. They were playing with a raggedy soccer ball and rocks set up as goals. They reminded me of home, the way I grew up playing soccer in the streets of Jordan with my brothers and cousins and neighbors. And I'd been coaching club soccer at the time. Had a soccer ball in the back of my car, grabbed it, got out of my car. Kids rushed me. They wanted the ball. I wanted to play, and so we haggled. They got the ball, and I got to play.
The kids were from Afghanistan, Liberia, and South Sudan, all middle school aged, all refugees. A memory from her childhood came rushing back to Mufla. She was born in Jordan, but her mother and grandparents were refugees from Syria who fled the first Assad regime in the 1960s.
Growing up, we were told to never forget where we came from. My grandmother, fiercely Syrian, grateful for the country that took her in and gave her a new start, but wanted to always make sure we never forgot who we were. And at a very young age, she took me to a Palestinian refugee camp on the outskirts of Amman. I think I was 8 at the time. When we got there, I was scared, uncomfortable, unsure. The environment to me was scary. It was very densely populated, chaos, a lot of poverty in a way I hadn't seen before. I just kind of like held on to her skirt. And she would go usually visit with some of the women and moms in the camp. And so she told me, why don't you go play with the kids? And I was like, no, they're not like me. I want to stay with you. She got down firmly to my level and said, you need to go play with them and don't come back until you have. I ended up joining a soccer game on this barren field and found out what I had in common with people that I thought were very, very different than me or were less than me. After I was done, went to her and we're getting ready to leave. And I'm kind of boasting. I was like, yeah, I played with them. They're such great soccer players. And then I said, haram them, which means pour them in Arabic.
But Mufla's grandmother immediately turned that expression of pity around with a different use of the same Arabic word, haram.
And said haram on us, that we were sinning, that we shouldn't be treating people this way and having them live in these conditions. And then she said something that I think has stuck with me and been kind of like my North Star. She said, don't feel sorry for them, believe in them.
Luma Mufla was lucky. Her grandparents and her mother were refugees, but the family was financially successful. So she went to British and American schools in Jordan, and then to Smith College in Massachusetts.
But my senior year was probably unlike most. That's the year I applied for political asylum. I'm gay. I knew that at a very young age. And in Jordan and parts of the Middle East, you can get the death penalty for being gay. So I knew that I would never be able to live my life in Jordan, and ended up making the really hard decision to apply for asylum. I lost my identity. I was no longer Jordanian. I will end up losing my family. But I had my freedom, and I was going to be able to live and live freely. And those are really hard decisions to make. and really tough to make it at age 22.
Did you consider yourself a refugee at that point?
I mean, technically I was. When you're forced to leave your country, for being persecuted or well-founded fear of persecution, that's the definition. I didn't have a home. So yeah.
But she knew her English skills and American college degree meant that her refugee experience was worlds away from the children she'd met at the camp in Jordan and from the teenaged soccer players she would later meet in Atlanta when she made that wrong turn. After that first pickup game, Mufla found herself making excuses to leave the struggling cafe she ran and go play soccer.
I asked kids if they wanted to form a team, and that was like the beginning of my education into how refugees and immigrants are treated in this country.
They named their team the Fugees, short for refugees. And in their first season, the kids started asking Mufla for help with their homework. Initially, she told them to go ask their parents. But then she learned most of the kids' parents couldn't read or write in English or even in their own native languages.
And so we'd sit on park benches trying to do homework, and I realized that the kids were being set up for failure. One story sticks out in my mind. One of my players, a B student, he had a good grasp of the English language, at least verbally, and he called over to me. He's like, "Hey, coach, can you help me with my homework? I have a headache." And I was like, "Yeah, sure." And so I read to him. He answered me back. I wrote in the answers. Second day, same thing happens. Like, "Coach, I have a headache." I was like, "Okay." A little bit worried about him, but, we did it. And then the third day, he did the same thing. And I was like, "I have a headache." And he's like, "No, I have a headache." And luckily, I was more stubborn. And he looked up at me and said, "Coach, I can't read." And it broke me. He was 12 at the time. And he had been in the public school system for 3 years. It's not what I believed America was about. You're not supposed to have kids in school that can't read or write. Change a few details about my story, about my experience, that could have been me.
Mufla started looking into it and learned the school district had a newcomer program for refugees. But it only lasted a few months. And then, without any real English fluency, the kids were placed into a regular class with others their same age. Now, if a refugee is in kindergarten or first grade, he might have a chance of keeping up. But Mufla's soccer players were landing in middle school, unable to read or write. It's no wonder English language learners have the lowest graduation rate of any group of students in public high schools, more than 15 percentage points below the national average.
And I asked myself, if this was my kid, what would I do? I sent him to a school that could meet his needs. There wasn't a school out there. I couldn't afford private school, so it was actually cheaper to start a school with one teacher and 6 kids and in a church basement.
That's literally what she did. This was 2006. Mufla and a couple of staff and some volunteers scrapped and scraped to get Fugees Academy up and running.
I've always believed if you do the right thing, the funding will follow. The money will come from somewhere. Sometimes a car wash and other times, a good grant.
Because the students are not paying tuition.
The students can't pay tuition, so it was a zero tuition private school.
Over the next decade, Fugees Academy would expand to 2 locations, one near Atlanta, one in Columbus, Ohio, with about 240 students in total. It attracted enough attention that Mufla was invited to give a TED Talk, which won her a standing ovation and lots of media coverage. Fugees Academy continues to be a free, private school education for 6th through 12th grades, and it is only for refugee and immigrant children.
They have to apply. We prioritize kids who speak a language other than English at home, kids who qualify for free and reduced lunch, and kids with the least amount of time in the country. Soccer is still a big part of it. Every kid in school plays on a soccer team.
Mandatory.
Mandatory, yep.
Why?
That's how we started. That was the hook for everyone, right? Like, soccer is this universal language. You can walk any part of the world and pick up a soccer ball and instantly have friends. So for us, it created a sense of belonging. The field is like our sacred space where it's familiar, it's healing, and then you're a part of a team. You're part of a group of kids who have gone through what you've gone through. Maybe not the exact same conflicts, but similar. And you're learning to play together and get along and feel like other people have your back when for so long you felt no one did.
At first, the application to attend Fuji's academy was just a soccer tryout.
And it's not to see who's the most talented or most gifted. It's to see which kid is willing to push themselves to their limit. Because the work we are asking them to do is hard. We're asking them to make 6 to 8 years of academic gains in 3 years. And so we want kids who, when they're confronted with something difficult, can power through it, can persevere through it. And then we look for kids who show up on time every day, even after we put them through like a really tough conditioning tryout, they're showing up the next day. On the last day, we do a scrimmage, and we look for the kids who take care of each other, who are not looking to put each other down, because you're going to need everybody around you to help you succeed. We did that for a number of years, and then I think word got out. It's like, if you survive tryouts, then you're going to get into the school. And we started having more kids apply than we had spots. And so we started administering an academic test. And I remember when we got a large influx of Syrian refugees, one of the moms was waiting outside the room for her son, and he comes out and looks defeated. And she's like, how'd you do? How'd you do? And he's like, I didn't understand anything. I'm not going to get in. I was like, no, you're the one getting in. Like, this is for you. And he looked at me. He's like, but I did terribly. And I'm like, yeah, that's why you need to be here.
And how are you teaching? I mean, if the goal is to try to get them up to, they come to the school not being able to even speak any English or understand or write it, and you're hoping that within 3 years or so, you're going to get them up to performing close to their own grade level. Like, what is the magic? What are you doing?
It's year round. Classes are small. It's rigorous. It's not like, okay, well, you kind of know this. All right, we're done. No, it's like you have to know it before you move up, right? It's having high expectations and holding everyone accountable to it. And it's also the athletic approach. It's like, all right, you learned this, and that's awesome, and you did a great job today, but tomorrow we need to take it to the next level, right?
So when you say it's year-round, like literally year-round, there's no summer break?
There's a short summer break. We do a 5-week summer program for all our students.
And how long is the school day?
The school day, August through end of May starts at 8 and the kids leave at 5:30.
And part of that is soccer practice in the afternoon?
Mm-hmm. Soccer practice and after school support in the afternoon.
Oh, so they do their homework on site as well?
Yeah. Our goal is by the time you get home, you eat, you shower, you're so tired, maybe you'll read for about 30 minutes and then go to bed.
And what happens if a student is failing their classes?
If they're failing their classes, they don't get to play in the game. You see a lot of people rally around that, right? So, because you need all your team playing in order to win. So you'll start seeing teammates making sure the kid shows up to school or is doing their homework or participating in class. The coach checks in on them regularly. Hey, do you have your grade up? Everybody's more invested in you passing, and it's not just all on you.
The culture is one where everyone's aware if someone is struggling?
Yeah, I mean, we do something that's pretty unconventional. We read our report cards out loud. And so everyone knows where everyone stands. Part of that is if someone in your community is struggling, you need to know about it, and you have a responsibility to help. And if you are the one struggling, you need to know that there are others in that room that are going to help you. They're not going to do the work for you, but they're going to help you.
How does that report? You're in the room with the rest of the school and you're saying, I'm getting a C in English.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just like that. English, C, math, B, art, F, yeah.
And what is the acceptable response from the audience?
Kids know when someone has improved. They'll notice if someone went from an F to a C. They shout each other out. During the week, they're saying that kids are working toward it. It is motivation. Kids get vested in it. They don't want to be up there failing, right? So there is a little bit of that, right? Like is it shameful? It's like, no, I don't want to fail because I don't want to let my teammate down, right? So I'm going to work hard for it.
How were you thinking about this idea of like segregation versus integration, that you were creating a school specifically and only for immigrant and refugee children, when so much of the, public school in America, especially since Brown versus Board of Education, is very much about like, we don't do separate but equal or separate but better. We do integration.
But we do segregate. Look at our schools. They're segregated by income. They're segregated by race. And it happens, right? And so we're just saying we want what's best for our community. And we want a place where our kids get to be surrounded by others like them, where they don't have to explain themselves or their families or their background, where that is celebrated and understood, and have that kind of bubble environment so they feel confident and then are ready to integrate back in. Because then that's when you have true integration, is when you're at the same playing field. If you're not, it's segregation.
So your goal, the goal of the Fugees Academy then, is to get these children performing up to their grade level, so that they can transfer into a public or private school and not have to be failing or in special ed.
Yeah, and some, our model is 6th through 12th grade, so we do have a large number of kids that stay with us through their senior year because the public school districts in a lot of our neighborhoods are failing. When they leave us, they're enrolling in community college, they're doing apprenticeships, they're going to 4-year colleges, and they're very confident in who they are and what they are capable of.
What does success look like for you?
Remember, early on, I would ask the kids, what is it that you want to be when you grow up? What do you want to do? And a lot of the kids said, I want to be able to take care of my family. I want to be able to take care of my mom. A lot of our parents work manual labor, some of them in the meat processing plants. And so the kids would say, okay, so if I want to do better, it's like lawyer, doctor, engineer, right? And so we're like, no, it's not just meat processing plant or lawyer, doctor, engineer. There's everything in between, right? And then being able to direct and advise students and their families as to what the best options are. We had a student in our program behind academically, and she worked really hard, during her middle school years. Family was illiterate for generations.
Where was she from?
Eritrea. Her mom was a teenage mom, and so was her grandmother. And her junior year, she got pregnant, and that was really hard. It was hard on her family, it was hard on her, but it's like, this is the situation, right? So you can choose to give up on a kid or say, hey, this is not gonna work out, or you need to figure something else out. But she stayed in school, graduated on time. Her beautiful daughter actually jumped on the stage as she was giving the graduation speech. And she did end up working at the chicken processing plant. But because she had a high school education, she was actually managing her mom's group. And she's ambitious and undeterred. And I think of the determination it took for her to do that and to stick with it when maybe others around her were telling her, no, stay at home, take care of your kid, you don't need to go to school. So maybe not the most conventional definition of success, but one that I hold very dear.
Luma Mufla is the founder of Fugees Academy. In 2022, the organization received a $10 million donation from philanthropist Mackenzie Scott, ex-wife of Amazon founder Jeff Bezos. That money will help Mufla and her team adapt the Fugees model for school districts to incorporate into their newcomer programs for refugee children. It'll include mandatory soccer for all students, by the way. Mufla says that is non-negotiable. She recently wrote a book about all of this called Learning America, One Woman's Fight for Educational Justice for Refugee Children. When refugees are resettled in America, they have their basic needs met initially.
We were taken to our new home. Every room, there's enough furnishing, a huge fridge stocked with food.
But to find long-term success building a new life in America, refugees need a deeper kind of welcome from the community. I'm Julie Rose. This is Top of Mind.
The decision to live your own home, everything you worked for it, your family, your friends, your neighbors, it's not an easy decision.
This is Aiden Batar.
I'm the Director of Migration and Refugee Services for Catholic Community Services.
Catholic Community Services is one of several nonprofits the United States government relies on to settle refugees. Batar helps hundreds of people fleeing war and violence establish themselves in Utah each year. Almost 30 years ago, he was one of them.
It was 1994. We were among the first refugee Somalis that were resettled in the state of Utah through Catholic Community Services. Originally, I'm from Somalia, and in 1990, Somali civil war broke.
Batar was newly graduated from college at the time, married with a toddler. The young family fled to a relative's home in a slightly safer part of the city. A bunch of other families were also crowded into that home, trying to survive.
It was very chaotic, and every day I would go to the market to look things to live. And one day I came back. My son, he was running around. He was 2 years old, and he was burned with hot boiling water, and I don't know how to describe that day, how my emotions and feelings, what I have seen. I witnessed my own son in my own eyes, that he was burned all over his body. There was no hospital, there was no medicine, no doctors, and he only lived 5 days after he was burned. And if there was an effective hospital and medicine, he could have been saved. But that was all the time he had in this world. And the day I buried my son, the next day I could not stay. So that's one of the reasons why we fled Somalia. We were so excited when we were told that the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program approved our application and that we're going to America. We're coming to Utah. We had a family member here in the state of Utah who was going to school at Utah State University, my brother-in-law. He's the one who sponsored us, the whole family. And the first day at the airport when, we came, and there was so many people waiting us at the gate. And my brother-in-law and his family, a lot of other people that I don't know who they were at the time, and people that work for Catholic Community Services, that were welcoming us. So it was very overwhelmingly when we have seen all those strangers that we didn't know welcoming us. Then we were taken to our new home. We walked into the house. I remember it was a 4-bedroom house, and every room there was enough furnishing, and a huge fridge stocked with food. We were overwhelmed.
The exact level of support refugees receive when they arrive in the U.S. depends a lot on where they end up. But what Batar's family experienced back in the 90s is still pretty standard. Government funding and community donations set refugee families up with the basics. They're immediately eligible for Social Security cards and can apply for low-income programs like food stamps and Medicaid. Within 6 to 8 months, they're expected to pretty much be on their feet and working.
So I remember my first job is working in a production line and earning what back then, $4.25 was the minimum wage. And my rent was $500 in that big house that we lived in. But we were a couple of us, myself and two of my brother-in-laws living with me at the time. We were all putting together our income and paying all the expenses.
Batar worked a swing shift at that factory, making exercise equipment for 2 years while taking English classes at a local university during the daytime. He had a law degree from Somalia.
But at the time, the universities were not equipped to deal with someone coming from a refugee background, to help them, start where they left off. But I had to worry about my kids and my family to provide them. So that's why I took the first job. But the refugees who are coming today, if they have a college degree and they want to go back to their professional field, there are programs available for them from day one that we help them recertify their education. And if they are doctors, there are programs that would help them become a doctor.
How did you end up getting involved then in the refugee resettlement?
In 1996, there were a wave of Somali refugees that were coming to Utah. So Catholic Community Services contacted me and they offered me a job. Without any doubt, I accepted the job. I started as a case manager, helping the refugees the same way that we were helped, and also helping them with doing case management, employment, and interpretation, and everything that the refugees needed to start a new life. So that's how I get involved.
In the years since, Batar says Utah has expanded the services it offers refugees. There's follow-up from a caseworker, language courses, career guidance, and so on. In most states, the period of intensive support from a caseworker lasts about 6 months, but in Utah, it's 2 years. Batar says that long-term commitment has helped establish a community of refugees in the state who are thriving, starting businesses, sending their kids to college, and creating cultural connections to help new refugees more quickly find their place. That's something that could have made a real difference for Batar's family arriving in Utah all those years ago.
One of the things that immediately I noticed when I arrived was that there wasn't a place to go for shopping, especially food.
Your traditional foods that you were familiar
halal
with.
Food, what we call
halal,
it. It's religiously prepared food like kosher, and also a place of worship. When I moved in Salt Lake in 1996, there was only one mosque, a small mosque. But over the years, the community grew, and we have close to 10 mosques now in Salt Lake area. And the Muslim community, it's over 50,000 now in Utah. So I think, all this were built by the refugees and students and, people that are coming to Utah to work. So, yeah, I think the refugees that are coming now, they have a community. Like if you're Somali, if you are Sudanese, if you are Congolese, if you are, Afghani, there's a community that people will meet them and they don't have to worry about where to worship, where to buy food, where to socialize with people and so forth, because that makes a huge difference.
Batar says when refugees are embraced with kindness and trust in a community, they're better able to put down roots and confidently express their own cultural identity, making the community more welcoming for those who come after them.
When you are new to a country and you don't have anyone, it is really hard. But when strangers coming to you and want to become friends with you, want to teach you the language, the culture, help you, the transition will go very smoothly, versus where some communities elsewhere in the United States, where you go to a neighborhood and people telling you, go back where you came from. It is completely different.
But Batar has noticed over the years that some refugee groups prompt a quicker, often more compassionate response from the public.
The evacuation of the Afghanis, for example, that we just recently happened, the amount of support that the community that have responded was so overwhelmingly. The reason is being because our soldiers were there, and many of the veterans that are in our community and people who have family members who have served in Afghanistan and so forth, they had so passion to help the Afghan refugees that have been coming, and the amount of support that we have received, it was very overwhelmingly. I wish that all the refugees that were coming to our community would have had that similar response. Like, for example, what we're seeing right now in Ukraine, people are so, generous to help the Ukrainian refugees, when they arrive. But there's a lot of other refugees that have been forgotten, that have been coming over the years, or their conflicts have been happening. For example, in Syria, Syrians have been going through exactly what the Ukrainians are going through right now. And yet, with the Syrian refugee crisis, we have not responded.
Now, the basic government support we talked about earlier is there for any refugee who gets approved to resettle in America. But U.S. politicians have been uneven in their willingness to allocate additional resources or resettlement slots for refugees from Syria, Iraq, and other conflicts in the Middle East. Meanwhile, communities have been inclined to greet those refugees with fear that they might pose a threat to our own safety or religious beliefs.
The media plays a major role as well. And because people are seeing the TV and radios and, all kind of media talking about the issues. If the issues being talked about every day, people will be aware, people will get more information.
But press coverage can backfire for refugees, too. Batar is frustrated that political rhetoric and media stories have created a disconnect in people's minds when they think about migrants arriving at the southern U.S. border seeking asylum.
I think people are not well informed.
What is the primary misconception that you think people have?
People are coming to our communities, taking our jobs, they are criminals, and those are the misconception people always have, which is not the truth. A lot of the families that we're seeing at the southern border, they're escaping violence and inhumane conditions, and they're not different than the refugees that we are bringing from war-zone countries.
Aidan Batar is Director of Migration and Refugee Services for Catholic Community Services in Utah. Liz Yevchich-Shomlai experienced that public rejection when she and her family fled the breakup of Yugoslavia.
We came from the wrong side, I guess, of the conflict.
Yevchich-Shomlai was a teenager at the time.
I was born and raised on the Serbian side. And, everyone heard in the news about the Bosnia. And so the Bosnians were the good guys and the Serbs were the bad guys. So I was what I like to call the non-sexy refugee because I just, I didn't fit the profile of the media. And no one listened to any of my story. So the fact that, I was a teenager, that I lost my mother during the flight, that we were homeless, that I was an A student, very educated, and I came from a home that was very strong in activist and civil society engagement. None of that was important. My father is an educated accountant who speaks fluently 3 languages, yet in the country where we were at, he was treated as a no one, and people ridiculed him, and he was not given any opportunities for anything because he was a Serb.
Yevchich-Shomlai's family resettled in Austria, where they struggled with persecution and a lack of support. She came to the U.S. for college, got a PhD in international conflict analysis in the U.K. She now lives in Arizona and works with a nonprofit called Their Story is Our Story, which collects and publishes the experiences of refugees in their own words.
As I've started working with Their Story is Our Story, I realized that I wish I had someone at the time when I was a refugee have a desire to listen. It is very empowering to actually have the ability to tell your story the way you want it to be heard, and not have someone else share it the way that they think it should be shared. And so what we provide is these people have story, they have identities, they're individuals, and they're beautiful, unique, intelligent human beings. And so what we offer to the table is sharing that individual narrative and giving them the power to share it in the way that they feel most comfortable with their story being shared. The other side of that, it is an incredible advocacy tool. As we educate people by sharing these narratives, the personal narratives, people are more connected to them, and they change their perception of what they thought of that label refugee. And with that, they change their action. And so we see an increased interest in participating, in helping. You can see that, across many of the states in the United States, you see there's so much more individual effort to aid with the necessities such as, food, clothing, helping with learning the language. It all starts with sharing of that personal individual story.
Yevchich-Shomlai says the next step community members can take in supporting refugees is to recognize the role the United States sometimes plays in conflicts that force people to flee. That might be through American economic interests, military intervention, or lack of intervention.
If you don't want to have refugees coming into your country, be careful about how you conduct your politics with that country. Sometimes domestic politics and international politics looks at how do I better my own situation without looking at what cause and effect does that have on outside world. And so it is, in a way, it is our responsibility as well to be a little bit more careful about how we choose our political parties, how we choose, places where we go and shop our clothes. It comes down to very simple things where we actually have to be a little bit more conscientious of how does my action impact another human being. I have so many people coming to me and saying, well, what can I do? And the very first thing you can do is you actually can call your representative and you can speak to your representative and you can speak for these people.
And say what? Say, let's take more refugees?
Say, hey, yes, we are able and we're capable. We can share. We have space. Let us take more in. I'm willing to help them learn the language and help them get into the labor market. Simple as that. And then the second one is the fact that we don't have to be afraid of a new person, of a newcomer. They come with different culture and they come with a different language. They eat food maybe that we are not used to, but that's the beauty of it. It's that diversity.
Liz Yevchich-Shomlai is a human rights researcher and associate director of Their Story is Our Story. You can read the refugee narratives they've collected online at tsosrefugees.org. The number of refugees accepted in the United States has dropped dramatically since the early 90s, when more than 100,000 people were resettled here each year. Just before the pandemic, that annual number had fallen to 30,000. The president sets a limit on how many refugees can come to America. President Trump cut the number each year he was in office. President Biden has raised it, but the actual number of refugees being admitted into the U.S. continues to drop. Whether you know it or not, there are probably refugees trying to build a new life in your community. To find out how you can help, search online for refugee resettlement in your state and reach out. Top of Mind is a production of BYU Radio. Today's episode was produced by me and Bailey Johnson, with help from Cleon Wall and Ciara Hewlett. We had music and sound design by Jacob Molaski, Jerem Hansen, and the post-production team at BYU Broadcasting. If you are enjoying Top of Mind, please rate and review the podcast wherever you listen. That'll help others to find us and feel the power of thinking again. I'm Julie Rose. We'll talk soon.